Without objection.
Scientists have documented carbon dioxide increases from 283 parts per million in 1800 to 315 parts per million in 1958 to current 411 parts per million. Americans want Congress to act. According to the Pew Research Center, most Americans currently list the environment as one of the top policy priorities. For Americans under 30, more than 3/4 of those surveyed think the environment should be a focus, and we need to listen to them. The good news is we have already begun acting. Despite public misconception, the United States leads the world in reducing emissions while we are growing our economy. In 2006, the U.S. GDP was slightly over $14 trillion, and CO2 emissions peaked at just over 6 gigatons. By 2019, our economy had grown by 55% to $21.7 trillion, while our CO2 emissions dropped 3.6% to 5.8 gigatons. During this time, we also witnessed a decrease in energy cost. However, there is much work that remains, and there's much that we can do. That's why I introduced the Trillion Trees Act as part of a broader initiative to offer practical solutions to this complex global problem. While the potential for emissions reductions and storage offered by trees and wood products as outlined in this policy is significant, it is not the only answer. There are two components to this legislation that I want to make sure everyone understands. First, this policy will result in reduced carbon emissions. In case you missed that, I will repeat, this policy will result in reduced carbon emissions. It will reduce carbon emissions through an incentive-based tax credit up to 25%, rewarding sustainable construction based on 3 criteria. Part of the credit will require reduction in energy used and carbon emitted in manufacturing and transporting building materials to the job site. Part of the credit will require a reduction in energy used and carbon emissions to heat, cool, ventilate, light, and operate the building over its lifetime. The remaining portion of the credit will be based on the amount of carbon stored in the completed structure. This policy will also result in reduced carbon emissions by capturing energy from dead residual biomass materials that are already on a pathway to becoming atmospheric carbon. This will offset the equivalent amount of carbon emitting energy that otherwise would have to be used to meet energy demands. Let me repeat again, this policy will result in reduced carbon emissions. The second component of the legislation that I want to make clear is that this policy will result in reducing CO2 concentrations that are already in the atmosphere. Think about it. If all man-made CO2 emissions were somehow miraculously stopped, what do we do about the 411 parts per million of CO2 already in the atmosphere? The answer is trees. Unequivocally, the most pragmatic, proactive, economical, and large-scale solution to reducing atmospheric carbon levels is sustainable forestry, and I respectfully ask anyone to offer a better solution. In every tree, miraculous science is constantly taking place. Every second of every day, quadrillions of subcell organelles called chloroplasts are at work in a single tree doing what they do best, combining water, sunlight, and carbon dioxide to make carbon-rich plant food while releasing oxygen back into the atmosphere. That carbon stays in the tree even after it's cut down and turned into buildings, furniture, and a whole host of other products. In fact, 40 to 50% of the dry weight of wood is carbon. 40 to 50% of this dais by weight is carbon. Why 1 trillion trees? 1 trillion is a big number, even for the planet. But we are at a point where we need a bold goal to focus our efforts on being the best stewards of our environment, and America has a history of leading the world in bold endeavors. The Trillion Trees Act acknowledges this bold goal and commits the United States to doing our part. The Trillion Trees Act, however, is not only about planting more trees. It's bad policy to simply plant trees and walk away. Hence, the Trillion Trees Act is all about management of our forest, keeping existing forest land in forest, and managing these forests where practical to improve resiliency and growth. The Trillion Trees Act also recognizes that the planet has limited growing space for forest. By contrast, there is no limit to how much carbon forests can pull from the atmosphere if we consider not just the trees that are growing, but also the wood products that these trees can create. Sustainable wood products manufacturing transfers carbon stored in the forest to the wood products and their end uses, resulting in a sustainable increase in carbon stores year after year. In turn, harvested wood makes space for new trees, restarting the cycle of sequestration. The United Nations projects 2.3 billion new urban dwellers by 2050. By employing bio-based materials, technologies, and construction assemblies with high carbon storage capacity and low embodied carbon emissions, we can create a durable, human-made global carbon pool while simultaneously reducing CO2 emissions associated with building sector activities. Mr. Chairman, I would like to also submit this paper from Nature Sustainability titled Buildings as a Global Carbon Sink. Every American can support planting a tree. If we can connect that action with sustainability and carbon storage, we are one big step closer to solving a complex problem. Mr. Chairman, I thank you for allowing me to highlight such a practical piece of legislation, and I look forward to answering any questions from you or other members of the committee, and I urge swift adoption of this legislation.
Bishop has